The dull impacts of their footsteps echoed through the long hallway with the rounded corners, along with the soft sound of their breathing, enhanced by the filters over their faces. The wooden floor creaked and slightly gave underneath their feet with each step they took, making James worried that it was getting ready to crack and break at any moment now, while Sheeta pulled him along inside of the orphanage. After a few steps, Sheeta finally relented and let go of his hand again, probably once she was sure that it was unlikely that he would just turn and leave again once she gave him the chance. Since her back was turned to him, James couldn't see the look on Sheeta's face as she gazed around, inspecting her surroundings carefully while having stopped dead in the middle of the hall, but her demeanor almost seemed wistful. He now also looked around himself, now that he wasn't being dragged along anymore. The hall was plain and bore no identifying text or welcome area or anything of the like. From the door, you entered right into the building proper. The hall itself was covered in dark wood nearly all around, although you could see parts of the concrete walls peek out from behind its covering in a gap close to the ceiling. You could have almost mistaken this for a fairly normal house like any other. Almost. If it hadn't been for one thing. The walls were over and over covered in scratches. Many hundred scratches, starting at about ankle height and reaching up all the way to about 2 meters. Scratches upon scratches upon scratches, forming deep crevices in the wood with just how many of them were layered on top of one another. In some places that had gotten less attention than others, you could see hints that there may have been some more delicate and deliberate carvings visible on the wood once, but it was impossible to even guess at what it might have been at this point. It was all scratched away. The scene almost looked like a picture out of a horror movie. James wasn't the only one observing the strange sight with slight hesitation. The guards had by now caught up to the two, and were now also inspecting the orphanage's interior with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. After a few seconds, Andrej even walked up to the wall and let the tips of his fingers glide along the thousands of deep marks overlapping each other. Then, the silence they all stood and observed in was finally broken, when Admir suddenly crossed his arms and jokingly asked, "So, are any of these yours?" The question was obviously directed at Sheeta, and basically everyone turned their heads towards the feline while waiting an answer. Sheeta scoffed from underneath her breath filter, which she was still wearing after using it for protection against the starlight earlier. "It's been years," she replied flamboyantly, and threw her arms out to gesture all around at the wooden panels. "These things have been replaced 3 times over in the meantime, if not more." Replaced? James looked around at what to him had seemed to be something like decades worth of damage once more. He had seen some badly damaged walls at schools, but generally those damages piled up over years and years. But this was something else, and these were supposedly replaced a couple of years ago at most. Seeing the deep scratches in the wood, even down at just the height of his ankles, very suddenly gave him some perspective on the scars on his left arm and the slight puncture wounds in his leg. If this was the kind of damage that small children could do just like that. Sheeta suddenly started to walk again, leaving everyone to look after her in surprise. "Come on, I'll show you around," she exclaimed over her shoulder, and moved on without waiting for everyone starting to hurry after her. A few more meters down, the hall opened up into a larger room that appeared to be a sort of hangout area or common room, with chairs, tables, and general niceties for children strewn all around, ranging from some books and some shelves to what looked like simple toys like stuffed animals or simple wooden figures. Something that immediately caught the eye was that the walls in here didn't look any better than the ones in the entrance. Neither did the tables, chairs, shelves, or any other form of furniture around. They all were covered in the same deep claw marks all over. Some of the table's legs even looked like they might snap if a headless toddler tried to climb on top of it. It was carved down to such thinness. However, the same was not true for either the books or the toys, which, while clearly showing signs of wear from being well used over the years, appeared to be undamaged for the most part. There still wasn't any sign of any sort of front desk or welcome area or the like. Not only that, but with the way that the toys were simply strewn around on the floor all across the room, as nobody had bothered to pick them up ever since they were left lying there by the children, the place gave off extreme feelings of emptiness, despite the very clear signs of being lived in. Sauntering further into the room, Sheeta bent down for a second, picking up a stuffed toy that looked somewhat like the fantasy monster version of a wild boar off the ground. Most likely it depicted some animal from Dunama in reality. With careful steps that made sure she didn't step on anything, she walked over to one of the tables and placed the toy down on top of its plate instead, briefly rubbing along its fuzzy and worn-out back, before turning her attention to a book that also laid there, discarded and opened to a random page somewhere in its middle. Careful not to accidentally close it and lose the page in the process, Sheeta picked it up and quickly checked the cover, most likely looking at which story it was, before placing it back down with an audible scoff. Looking around, most of the toys seemed to depict different animals in some form, which honestly surprised James since, according to Sheeta, Mia didn't exactly have the same cuteness drive that humans did, and he assumed the same was true for their children as well. Yet he could see a fish-like being here, one of the lizards he had to remove from their hotel room at some point there, and even... "So, this is where your obsession started?" Admir asked, still being basically the only human to speak in this eerie place, while he briefly knelt down and picked up the stuffed version of the generally bred-for-food primates that were plentifully available on the planet. He knocked against it with a flat hand as if he wanted to shake some dust off it. However, the toy seemed to be clean enough that it had no effect. Sheeta turned to him, surprised, the projected face on her mask looking questioningly for what he might mean by that, as he waggled the toy around demonstratively. Seeing what he was saying, Sheeta scoffed again, and quickly sauntered over to him to take the plushie out of his hand. She held it with both hands for a second, looking down at it, melancholically, before suddenly stating, "I never liked the monkey ones," tossing it over her shoulder dismissively, causing it to impact on the wooden plate of a table with a dull thunk after a second of flight. Right after, she gave James a pert glance, which got a giggle out of Admir. By now, most of the humans are spread throughout the room, and most of them had gotten stuck inspecting the claw marks on some piece of furniture, their natural curiosity telling them to run their fingers along the damage for no particular reason. James, meanwhile, walked over to Sheeta and looked down at the open book lying on the table's bumpy and uneven plate. Obviously he didn't understand a word of what was written there. In fact, he couldn't even identify any of the letters or how they would be pronounced. "Careful, they get really mad if you make them lose their page," Sheeta warned him jokingly, although James had never even reached down for the book. "Well, I can relate to that," Athena replied to that from the other side of the room. Her long ponytail of blonde hair nearly touched the ground as she squatted down deeply to look at some of the lower claw marks on the wall. "Is this what they do when they get mad?" She pointed at the damage and looked back at Sheeta expectantly. Sheeta shook her head. "That's what they do when they're bored," she explained nonchalantly. "Toys can only keep you entertained for so long, and at some point you've read all the books." Clearly she was speaking from experience here. On the other side of the room, Tuya crossed her arms while her foot nervously tapped the ground, and she glanced around the room constantly. "Where is everybody?" she asked, once there was a moment of dead air again. She seemed even more uneasy in this place than James felt, and that was saying something. Maybe she had seen one too many horror movies with children in the main role. Sheeta shrugged, turned around and sat backwards on the table, giving James anxiety that the thin plate and legs might just snap underneath her as she did. However, luckily, it seemed to hold. "The older ones are out in the city finding something to do," she explained casually, and then turned her head to glance at a flight of stairs leading upwards from the back of the room. "Half of them are probably off screwing somewhere, given the time of year. Let's hope they don't make more brass for this place. And the caretakers are probably upstairs, putting the younger ones to bed for some additional sleep, while they clean up the place." Although cleaning up the place sounded a bit weird with all of the toys casually scattered across the floor, James did have to admit that, if nothing else, the place had been remarkably clean so far. Sheeta then seemed to notice Andrej inspecting some of the doors leading out of this big common room, although despite his curiosity, it did not seem like he was actually planning to open it. Sheeta didn't care for his plans though, and after quickly crossing the distance between them, she immediately pulled the scratched up leftovers of a door open without hesitation. Behind it was a simple kitchen, apart from the fact that it seemed to be furnished in stainless steel exclusively, forming a quite drastic contrast to the mostly wooden rest of the building's interior. Although, if James had to guess, and if Sheeta's earlier suggestions were any indication, it was likely that whoever was paying for all of this simply did not feel like having to replace expensive kitchen utilities every couple of years, just because children got bored. But the pristine look of tiled walls and metal furniture, all of course with rounded corners and polished to a sheen, did still feel out of place, even with that knowledge. Also, there was no one inside of the kitchen as well, which made sense given that nobody came out to check who had been making this much strange noise. However, sometimes the universe had a strange sense of both humour and timing, because exactly as James had thought that, there were suddenly very quiet, but still noticeable footsteps hurrying down the stairs in the back. All of the humans' heads immediately snapped in the direction of the stairs, while Shida, who had heard the approaching footsteps for a lot longer than they had already, turned a bit more leisurely. "I told ya! The kitchen is off!" a voice yelled in Sayamoit, clearly agitated about having to repeat something that it had said many times before. However, it stopped in the middle of the sentence, as its owner had reached the bottom of the stairs, and found himself faced with a group of darkly dressed, masked, and very much armed individuals. Next to her, Shida could already feel the Major tense up, while his mind most likely raced to just how exactly they would explain themselves here. And Shida began to understand what James had meant earlier, with it maybe being awkward to just enter a place like this. However, just because she understood it, didn't mean she relented, as she remained quite relaxed. The male Miat, dressed in a beige duster that covered most of his body, and plain shirt and pants underneath, regarded the group with a clear, "what the hell is going on here?" look on his face. His dark eyes were wide and quickly scanned from one masked individual to the next, every now and then also twitching downwards to the weapons fastened to their bodies in one way or another. His ears stood up straight and opened wide towards the group on the top of his shorn head, while his tail slowly swayed left to right in a wave-like form. Although he definitely seemed suspicious and tense, he wasn't really nervous so far. "Hello?" he greeted, apparently remembering that he'd better be polite with company like this after a few seconds. "Can I help you?" His tone indicated that he somehow doubted the group of masked individuals was here to either drop off a child, or even look for one to adopt, while he simultaneously couldn't think of any other reason someone would come here at first. That was until something seemed to suddenly dawn on him. "Oh no," he exclaimed, leaning his head back and scrunching up his face while closing his eyes tightly and mouthing something quietly, before once again audibly adding, "Which one is it?" The humans all glanced at each other for a second before looking back at Shida in search of help, since none of them understood a word of what he was saying, but his reaction clearly seemed at least familiar to them. With a smirk underneath it, Shida then finally lifted her hands, releasing the seal on her filter with a hiss before pulling the uncomfortable thing off her head, shaking out her hair before looking back at the man while putting the device down on the table next to her. "Nothing of the sort," she assured the caretaker with a chuckle, and although he seemingly remained skeptical that one of his brats hadn't gotten involved with some people you really didn't want to get involved with, he at least slightly relaxed at her words and looked at her again. "We're just here on a visit. I'm showing my friends where I used to live." "Your friends?" The man repeated her words and looked at the humans, his ears suspiciously folding back as he regarded their masks that projected sheepish faces back at him, as the primates were still stuck listening to a conversation they could not understand, but seemingly wanted to, at least not appear threatening while doing so. After he was done inspecting them in a way one might regard a bunch of delinquents while passing them at a street corner, his eyes returned to Shida's face. His mouth opened to say something, however nothing came out but a stalking breath, as his eyes suddenly widened in realization, and his ears shot straight up again. "Goyas be jealous," he mumbled after his mouth had opened and closed in vain attempts at speech a few more times. "Shida? Is that you?" Shida couldn't suppress her surprised reaction, as she slightly flinched at a mention of her own name, and her ears now also shot up, while her eyes narrowed suspiciously on the man's face. He knew her? But how? He seemed way too young to be one of the caretakers from back when she still called this place her home. And if he wasn't one of them, then who? Quarama? A name finally broke out of her mouth before she could realize that she was speaking, the realization hitting her like a charging boar. Just like her, Quarama had been a brat of the house back in the day, an unruly boy that took to the illicit ways the people around had been trying to teach each and every one of them back in the day, like a pig to a fresh kill. Unlike Shida, it seemed that he had simply stayed here, even after he had turned into an adult and could go wherever he wanted. "It is you," the man exclaimed, treating her reaction as confirmation. Disregarding most of his survival instincts, the man took a few steps closer. Luckily for him, the humans weren't nearly as sketchy as they might have looked, and seeing no adverse reaction to his approach from Shida, Minnie looked at him curiously as he sauntered towards his fellow feline. Her expectations slightly skewed by too much human contact at this point. Shida had almost expected the reaction to be a bit stronger, and she briefly braced for a rough tackle-turned-hug that obviously wouldn't come. Koroma inspected her up and down, his cheeks lifting nearly to the point that she could see his fangs, even with his mouth closed. "You're looking good," he started out, but it didn't sound like he fully meant it, although it wasn't a complete lie either. More an opening compliment to butter her up before the conversation. "But I thought you were off-planet. Didn't take you to be a returner after such a long time." The way he said it was almost like an accusation disguised as an unasked question, and it reminded Shida a lot of the way Loijivar had welcomed her back home when they had first arrived in Dunima. However, Shida was determined to not let that scratch her ego, not that she had actually expected a warm welcome or anything. Her leaving meant one less brat to take care of in this place, and little more. "Seems you've not been keeping up with the news," Shida replied in an almost scolding manner, while crossing her arms and shaking her head dismissively. "I'm almost disappointed." Koroma's face turned into a mocking visage for a moment, as he apparently forgot himself for a second. Shida was sure he was just moments away from asking just what someone like her would even do on the news. However, he wasn't quite that dense, even if he apparently threatened to be at times, and he quickly became aware of the people surrounding him again. Certainly they at least seemed like they might be able to do something newsworthy. Shida lifted her hands and made a round gesture at the surrounding humans. "Allow me to introduce the first diplomatic delegation of humans on Dunima," she explained, with another wide gesture, before she started walking over to James and putting a hand on his shoulder. "Led by the Honorary Human Ambassador James Aldwin." James may not have understood most of what she was saying, but he was aware enough to realize when he was being introduced, and so he quickly raised his hand for a wave and mumbled a quick greeting. Koroma clicked his tongue while letting out a hoarse laugh at her explanation, his gaze fixating on James for a moment. "And the military chose you for a mission like that?" he asked in disbelief for a moment, before scratching at his chin and reconsidering that. "Wait, I get it. It's because you're a local, isn't it? Can't be many of those around in the communal fleet." Shida let out an exasperated sigh. He hadn't just not been paying attention to the news, it seemed he was almost completely unaware of their existence, and here she thought he had at least picked up on one single useful thing from the shady people trying to get them into their trade back in the day. "Something like that," she replied in a mumble, really not feeling like explaining months' worth of intergalactic political developments to her old housemate. Once again, she was suddenly glad that she had gotten out of this place when she did. Admittedly, the scratches on the walls and some of the toys and books did wake some semi-pleasant memories from back when she was such a small kitten that she understood nothing of the world around her, and was easily made happy by just a toy and a bit of attention, of which she even then got too little back in the day. But everything she could remember about times when she was fully aware, like the other brats or the days on the street while avoiding it to stay with the caretakers as much as possible, left her with nothing but a bitter taste in her mouth. Something about her thoughts must have shown on her face, because James suddenly reached an arm out and gently put it on her back reassuringly. To that, the lurid amusement on Koroma's face expedited. I see how it is," he said with a mocking tone and another hoarse laugh that sounded like something may seriously be wrong with his throat or lungs at this point. "Here to introduce him to some of the old farts. Believe it or not, they're still refusing to bite it around here." Shida shuddered even at the thought. "Much as I'd like to rub some things under their noses," she replied with a glance over at James and another one to the stairs leading to the upper levels. "I would quite literally rather do almost anything else. I'm just here to show them around, as I said." When thinking about the people that took care of her back then, she felt mostly apathetic. There had never been too much of a connection between them, as those people were mostly just there to make some rules and socialize her, but little more. However, what irked her more was that it led her thoughts towards the direction of someone else, someone she had cared significantly more about, and the memory of whom therefore hurt all the more as well. And she knew that from that hurt would spark anger, if she let it. Korima dismissed her with a scoff. "Suit yourself," he said, with a shrug, and began to turn away from her. "Just don't break anything while you're here." He then proceeded to still completely disregard the humans as he made his way back to the stairs, before climbing up to the level above them quickly, taking multiple stairs with each step. She'd looked after him for a second, before she heard James audibly clear his throat. "A friend of yours?" he asked, once her ear turned in his direction, and he therefore knew she was listening. "Just another brat from around here," she replied calmly. "Back from when I didn't like my hair pulled." It was a strangely sobering moment, seeing someone she had grown up with still live his life around here, seemingly without so much as the hint of an idea of the chaos that was happening all around him. Despite everything, she was still very much glad to have gotten out of here. However, she still couldn't help but wonder what might have been, even if she didn't want to. In the following tour of the place, during which she got to show off the rather mundane if constantly demolished rest of the house, while avoiding the older caretakers to the best of her abilities by staying away from the large rooms filled with rows of beds. The humans remained curious, although after their first shock had worn off, they quite quickly realised that, scratched walls or not, this was basically still just a house, even if a bunch of brats lived their mediocre lives here. Bathrooms and halls and rooms to play or be socialised in could only get so interesting, after all. Same for the bedrooms of the caretakers, who lived in the building for the most part. "So, how many children do they usually care for here?" James asked at some point, regarding the destroyed walls with an appreciative tone in his voice. She just shrugged. "If nothing's changed since my days, they can have up to 70 brats in here," she replied, thinking back to the many filled beds she had seen at one point or another. "Though most I've ever seen personally was 62, and most of those were way older than me and left relatively soon. I guess people get better and better at not having unwanted children." James swallowed visibly and looked around. 70, he repeated after her hesitantly, and although it was warped by the amplifier of his mask, his voice seemed to falter a bit. She'd have wondered what orphanages on Earth were like. Sure, there had to be brats there as well, and given the human population, probably plenty of them. Then again, they were social and didn't seem to care about spending unnecessary money, so maybe more people took one home just for the sake of it. Took one home. The brief snippet of a conversation that she and the humans had had back on the shuttle before they noticed the riots came to her mind. Well, right now was most definitely one of the most awful moments possible to even think about taking a child home. The future was way too unsure for that. But if they did, what kind would he want? And what kind would she want? With the thought in mind, she glanced over at James, although obviously she couldn't magically read the answer to her questions from the vague implication of a face projected onto the visor of his mask. Would he care? He seemed to be getting along with the kittens just fine, but was that a one-time thing? Suddenly, Sheeta became aware that, after having gotten some help with her current condition last night, her body had decided to activate some more of her deep-seated instincts, just on the off chance something had taken root, impossible as that may be. Maybe she should have still taken her medicine this morning, instead of disregarding it on the basis of feeling well enough. She should do that on the shuttle back, she decided. All these motherly thoughts would make her break out in rashes. After growing up in a place like this, how would she even take care of one of the brats? The only way she knew how to was from... She'd have felt her fists clenching up again in a sudden and rather unbecoming bout of rage, which tended to happen these days the more she thought about her former father figure, as all other emotions entangled in her memory with the captain seemed to lash out as soon as they were disturbed from their peaceful slumber in the back of her mind, turning into one and the same. Feeling that she needed an outlet, and she needed it fast, Sheeta swung out her left arm, the sharp claws at the end of her fingers burying deep into the already destroyed wooden wall with a sound akin to an arrow hitting its target. All the humans turned to her with surprised expressions projected on their masks, some even having ever so slightly jolted away from her position. Now they all stared over while she stood there, her claws buried deep into the wood, and breathing heavily. Slowly she began to drag her hand down, the sound of her claws cutting and pushing through the grain of the relatively soft wood, being amplified by the thick panel taking up the entire wall, and thus filling the empty hall almost completely. Having not used them in such a way in a long time, the feeling of the wood coming apart underneath her claws felt pretty good, and reminded her of her past long before she had many worries or wrath bottled up within her. Said soothing feeling in her hand, as well as the deep, controlled breaths she took, soon helped her calm down again, her emotions evaporating just as quickly as they had overcome her. First her uniform, then the shuttle, and now this, even if it was only sporadically. This couldn't keep happening. James carefully approached her from the side, while she pulled her hand back, leaving behind 5 fresh and significantly deep claw marks on the wall. Luckily, one scratch more really wouldn't make much difference to the big picture, even if her claws admittedly did a little more damage than those of literal children. "You okay?" James asked, after taking a moment to pause and watch her calm down. "I am now," she replied with a nod. "You want to talk about it?" James continued, asking, while putting a hand on her shoulder. She'd have thought about that. Did she? "Yes," was what she finally decided on, looking at him with a soft smile. "But not here, not now." James nodded understandingly, before glancing over at the damage she'd caused to the wall. He then chortled. "Would you be offended if I told you that I kinda get why you didn't like living here?" he asked, allowing her to change the topic since she wanted to continue the current one later. She'd scoffed. "I'd be upset if you didn't." Soon after, their scheduled takeoff came closer and closer, and they left the orphanage, and with it all of the cramps behind them. While getting an insight into Sheeta's past had been interesting, James could tell that any connection she still felt to this place was marginal at best, and toxic at worst, and so he did his best to not really see this place as her childhood home, like one he had good memories of, and more like a footnote in her past. Admittedly, he hated contributing to the age-old stereotype that orphanages were somehow places bad for children that caused suffering, and when it came down to it, this place was still better than no one caring for the children at all, technically. But still, the impression that he had gotten from this place was anything but positive. And although the thought was admittedly horrible if he thought about it for too long, he honestly was glad that he had not run into any more Miat kittens during their visit. The ones in Zishidi's office had been one thing. At least by the looks of it, they had still been relatively well cared for, and while this orphanage was admittedly clean, James somehow had his doubts about the condition the nominative brats might be in, given the state of the walls alone. He started to understand what Avezalon meant by these places not taking care of the children. Once in the shuttle, he had to take a step back into himself for a second, and soon, he realized one thing of which he didn't know how exactly to feel about it. If he was being honest with himself, while visiting this planet and learning about its culture and its essence had been exciting and invigorating, all in all, Dunamir in his current state just wasn't for him. Maybe it was just because he was a human and therefore bred for sociality, but even if it behaved politely, this entire place was simply too generally mean-spirited for him personally. And he really wondered how a place like this could have produced someone like Sheeta. But then again, maybe it hadn't. He was snapped out of his thoughts when their pilot announced that they would soon be landing again. It seemed that the riots had either been completely cleared out overnight, or had cleared out by themselves. Anyway, the streets, while busy, appeared to be no longer actively dangerous, or at least not any more than they generally were on Dunamir. Hoping to not get into pondering again, James distracted himself on their way back to the hotel by daydreaming about a nice long shower underneath the hilariously posh waterfall of their room, as well as a fresh change of clothes, as the shirt from the previous day by now stuck to his skin like this was a wet t-shirt contest. Of course, they had already made their arrival known to the other half of their guard team, who had been nervously waiting for their return ever since the message that they would take an unplanned detour while the people remaining at the hotel were to sit out the protests from inside of their rooms. "I hope being me for a couple of days was not all too awful," James asked the sergeant, who had filled in for him for the time the mission had still been undercover on his part, even if things hadn't quite worked out as planned. "It was an honor, sir," the sergeant replied with a leisurely joking tone of voice, and nonetheless sounded at least respectful. James dismissed him with a laugh and shooed the remaining soldiers out of his room, so they could get updated on the situation by the Major. Maybe he should have technically been part of that as well, but he was already up to date, and he felt that a new change of clothes really shouldn't wait any longer if he could help it. Although, since he had already been battered by Satak's heat once again, he decided he should rinse off in the shower first. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, Sheeta decided to join him today, which made the shower take just a little bit longer than usual, and drying off after just a little more. Right after, they finally felt clean again, adding to their good mood, as they could finally get dressed properly, both opting out of the UHSDF uniform this time, as James returned to his suit, and Sheeta decided to show off in her metal clothing once again. Of course, the day was still young, and work was still to be done, so they didn't get to hang around and just enjoy the feeling of being clean for long. First order of business was, of course, to get new information from back on Earth, telling him what the leadership had decided to do about the whole Zisha D and Avezalon situation. Meanwhile, as he got ready to do that, Sheeta jumped into one of the room's armchairs, and immediately got to turning the TV to the local news station again. From what James could tell, the current program was a sort of recap of the previous night's protests, or at least that was what the pictures of angry hordes of Miat roaming the streets suggested to him. He really hoped that the analysts back home had decided on allowing him to tell the mysterious Avezalon to bugger off. As much as he disliked Kwafwem and his methods, starving the people out to make them angry was not a method he condoned either, and if they wanted his help, they would have to be willing to go for another approach. However, just as speaking of the devil tended to summon him or his sins, it seemed that the universe's sense of comedic timing remained one of the fundamental constants of the world, because right as James got ready to make the all-important call home, his phone suddenly came to life with a call from a known contact. Quafrem Thera Comultopeno calling. James hesitated for a second. What could they want from him? They made it quite clear that they wanted to have nothing to do with him so far. Maybe they just wanted to keep up with the publicity stunt of seemingly interacting with the humans. He didn't know how much he believed that, but he also wouldn't find out by just staring at his phone. Hello, he greeted into the phone, having lost the general habit of answering with his name ever since coming to Dunama. Hello, James. I hope this is not a bad time. Lord Javar's familiarly calm and cold voice replied from the other side of the connection. But although he sounded cold, there was something different about his voice. Curious, of course, but after the last days of talking to Avezalon, James had to admit that even Lord Javar's reserved behaviour was a serious step up when it came to conversation partners he extended some trust to. At least he could trust Lord Javar to try and screw him over. The hotel staff called you about me returning a while ago, didn't they? James immediately assumed, and took a step backwards to sit down on the corner of the bed, throwing a dismissive wave over at Sheeta, as she turned to see what was going on before signing Lord Javar's name. Somehow, it didn't take Lord Javar to be the type of guy to constantly brood over security footage. He had people to do stuff like that for him, so much was clear. After yesterday's disorder, I felt it adequate to watch out for your safety. The mayor's voice replied professionally. You are still our guest, after all. James stretched himself slightly, the strain seeping into his voice as he asked, Well, I'm healthy and in one piece. Thank you for your concern. But I find it hard to believe that that's why you've called me. Lord Javar chortled briefly. Of course not, he replied, and stopped beating around the bush. Or stalking a corpse, as the people said around here. Kwafwem would like to invite you to another personal meeting. He has expressed interest in some of your offers. Offers? James raised an eyebrow. He didn't remember making any offers. Although, if he thought about it, this was most likely just the Miat business way of saying, we'd like to request something, or we have a possible deal for you. Are you interested? Lord Javar pried further, as James was quiet for a second. Well, that was kind of his job. Sure, James replied. We can schedule something.